Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this third session of our Seedy Saturday talks hosted by the Denman Growers and Producers Alliance. This morning we've got a talk by members of Plan Bean, and that will be on trying to increase resilience in our food system by growing pulses. So Joan Donahue is sort of going to host that talk, and then there are a few other members of the initiative on the call on the meeting as well, who I think will jump in at some point. I just want to give a quick reminder that if you would like to make a donation or get a membership to the Denman Growers and Producers Alliance, you can do that on the website, and I just put a link into the chat where you can do that. So proceeds from the talks go to supporting the GPA and to supporting having speakers for us. So yeah, I'll just turn it over to Joan now. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Erica. I was worried I muted myself for a second. So I'm Joan, and I'm one of the members of Plan Bean. I just want to let people know that if you've been on Zoom a lot, you know where the chat button is. It's at the top in the shared screen mode for me. It might be at the bottom on your screen, but it's a little message like a talking box, and you're welcome to type things in. If you think of a question you want to ask, we're going to do questions at the end for the most part, unless they're clarifying questions or something you missed on a slide and you wanted to take a note. But the presentation is being recorded, so you can go to the GPA website afterwards and rewatch it, or just fast forward to the part that you missed. So I won't be addressing the things in the chat during our talk. We'll go through them after as we, gather questions. But Erica will be watching out on the chat in case there are questions that seem more timely that we should interrupt to address, because that does happen. So before we start, I want to ask you all, I know you've gotten all comfy and probably have your coffee or tea out there, but we're going to do an activity near the end of the presentation. And for that, I'd like you to have a little, I'm just going to shove my screen down here, a little bowl of beans. These are some of our Plan Bean beans. If you have your own bean seed that you've grown, wonderful. And if you have beans in your pantry, that's also great. Or lentils or chickpeas or peas, any kind of pulse, like a dried seed of the legume family. Just maybe grab a little handful, put it in a bowl or a cup, and come back to the screen, and I'll give you a couple of minutes for that, or a minute or so, I guess. It'll be worth it, believe me. And in the meantime, I just ask you to read the quote that's on the screen. It's from Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is I believe she's Anishinaabe and Potawatomi from upstate New York and Vermont area. She's an Indigenous writer who wrote the book Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a very well-known book. It's like basically nature, science, Indigenous knowledge all woven together. And it's beautiful if you're a grower, a gardener of any kind. It's just very uplifting book if you're someone who feels and wants to feel more connected to the land. I really encourage you to pick up the book. And I realize I forgot to put at the bottom that this quote is from Braiding Sweetgrass. And she's written a number of publications, but that's probably the most well-known.
And I go ahead. Jump in really quickly here too, because I didn't acknowledge at the beginning that this talk is taking place on the traditional unceded lands of the Comox and Qualicum and Sli-Amin and other Coast Salish nations. So just wanted to acknowledge that, since I forgot to say it in my preamble. Thanks.
Thanks, Erica. And I had it written down here, so we would have got to it eventually. But thanks for for mentioning that. I should have said it at the beginning as well. So does it look like people are back now? Pretty much, right? Okay, great. I'm going to just assume people have grabbed a few beans if you can, and you're back with us. So today I'm going to be talking about Plan B or Plan Bean, which is a little project that a bunch of us here on Denman started, 5 of us here on Denman started in 2020. And that's us there. So I'm Joan, there's Heidi and Wind and Lisa and Heather. And we all live on Denman, we're all gardeners. And we were very inspired by Dan Jason's talk on the power of pulses. And there's a book by that name as well. And probably many of you have seen it or read it. And that happened at one of these CD Saturday, an in-person one, because it was just before COVID. That happened in 2020. And Wind and I, well, Wind actually approached me and said, let's do something about this, you know? And so I also give kudos to Wind for the name, which is Plan B, parenthesis EAN. And the reason for that is because Plan A, BAU, or business as usual, is clearly not working. And I'll just go over some of the reasons why it's not working. We know most of these. Our global food systems are major contributors to climate change throughout the production chain and the food and the supply chain. There are long distance networks. A lot of the food we eat comes from very far away. It's grown with pesticides, exploitative labor in many cases. And those supply chains, as we've seen during COVID, are very complex, but can often be very fragile. And so, you know, it's easy for, increasing climate events, extreme events to interrupt supply chains. And that could be flooding or storms or, hail, things like that ruin crops and so on. Also, to grow food on such a large scale requires poisoning the land often. And I know that most of us who are here today, or probably all of us, are very committed to not poisoning the land. So beans are a great answer to that because they're pretty easy to grow. So I think the increasing climate catastrophes. Last year on Denman, we saw a couple of major heat waves. It was rather unprecedented and had a lot of us gardeners scrambling to save our plants. And we experienced that in the bean field as well. So I'll talk about that later on. What can we do about it as individuals and as small groups of humans? One of the things that is really attractive about our project, was attractive to us, is returning to a more sustainable diet, is encouraging ourselves to eat more pulses, to eat more beans. We like meat in our household, and we know that it takes a toll on the land, so we buy local meat as much as possible, but still we are very committed to reducing our consumption of more of crops or production or foods that are heavier on the land. We know that meat takes much more resources to produce per pound than a pound of beans. And beans combined with whole grains or nuts provides you with a very high quality protein that you don't have to worry about not eating meat if you're eating that kind of protein. Also, beans, for that reason, it's not surprising that beans have been and still are a traditional food among many people in many continents of the world. There are very few places where beans were not cultivated very early on. The Pacific Northwest is one of those places, but certainly on Turtle Island or North America, we have seen and have evidence of beans being produced by indigenous peoples well back into history. The Three Sisters is one of the most iconic, I guess, representations of not only a permaculture type guild of plants that grow well together, but also just simply the use of beans. Um, and another reason, another response that we can do as individuals is to foster resilient local food systems. On Denman, we're so privileged, and I know many of you, if you're coming from Gulf Islands, you're probably similarly privileged to have a really robust local food system with lots of growers and producers and people who keep livestock and sell eggs. And it's easy to get most of your food needs on island, and that's especially true in the growing season, of course. But beans are a way to do that year round because they're so easy to store. So I think legumes, pulses, and I'll get to what I mean by pulses in a minute for those of you who aren't sure. They're really a key crop for a local resilient food system. And another thing is to skill ourselves up. We wanted to learn how to do it. Luckily, beans are pretty easy, pretty low tech, and they're very friendly for people who are just learning. So that gives us the ability to create our own food that can be protein, which is one of the hardest foods to get if you're growing it yourself. And to learn how to process and store that food. And beans, unlike many other products that we consume, like meat, are incredibly long-lived. So they're very easy to store even for the long term. And that's a great advantage. So finally, I want to throw it forward and say that another aspect that we're very aware of in our project is the future generations. We know that coming times will be even more challenging than they are now. And so part of building those systems now, supporting resilient local food systems, skilling ourselves in how to feed ourselves, not just individually necessarily, but as a collective, as a community, is a kind of preparation for the future, because we can pass those skills on to our children and our grandchildren, and they can pass them on down the generations. And since a lot of those skills have been lost over the years or kind of reduced, let's say, not as many people have the knowledge and experience, we wanted to feel that we were revitalizing this kind of knowledge and experience that could be passed down to future generations. So what are beans and what are their benefits? I've been talking a lot about pulses, and I referred to Dan Jason's book on the power of pulses. And pulses are basically the edible seeds of plants in the legume family that are harvested for drying. So green beans, peas out of the pod, like fresh peas and so on, they're legumes, as we know, but they're not pulses. They're not considered pulses. Kidney beans, which are left on the plant to dry and then harvested, are pulses. Peanuts and soybeans are also legumes, but they're in a special category because they have a very high oil content. So they are also not considered pulses, but they are legumes. And unlike peanuts and soybeans, the pulses that I'll be talking about today, which are called the common bean, they contain virtually no fat, but are very high in protein and fiber. That's how it goes. Okay. So scientifically, in terms of Western science, beans are in the family Fabaceae or Leguminosae. And it's the third largest family among angiosperms, which are flowering plants that produce flowers and seed and reproduce through that mechanism. Pulses are, I'm just going to put all these in because I realize that I don't know what's coming up. So pulses in this family include the common bean, Phaseolus vulgaris. It's the vulgar bean. And that includes most of what we think of as beans, dry beans for eating. And we, Plan Bean, grew many different, or a dozen different types of those this year and more the year before. They are a warm weather crop. They originated in South America. And they made their way to Europe after the Americas were colonized. And then some varieties were produced there and made their way back to North America. So they've been all over the map, but they originated in North America. Runner beans, so scarlet runners, white runners, and other kinds of runners are also native to the Americas, also a warm weather crop. And you often read that they're perennial, but some people might have experience with that, but they're usually cultivated as an annual. Lima beans, which are kind of like broad beans, but they're actually not. They're a different species of bean, is native to the Americas. And broad beans, which look like them a little bit, are fava beans, are native to the Old World or to Europe, the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia, as are peas and chickpeas. And that small group is those Old World pulses are cool weather crops. And there are reasons why they're not the best suited to this bioregion. And I'll talk about that later on. Let's carry on. I'm just going to check my notes. Okay. So the qualities of beans or their properties. This is all the pictures, by the way, in this slideshow, in this presentation, are from our bean project, except for one, and you'll know when it isn't. But yeah, so this is a picture of last year, our trellis and the bean field. Probably the runner beans don't look very high, so it's probably sometime in July. Beans are a summer crop. I've already said that almost everywhere. When I say beans today, I'm talking about the common bean or Phaseolus vulgaris, which are the ones that we have focused on in our project. Not exclusively, but I'll talk about that too. Common beans are self-fertile, but so they don't tend to cross-pollinate. It does happen sometimes though, and insects have been shown to improve the rate of pollination among beans, but not significantly. But they do certainly enhance pollination. But it's unusual to find a bean that has crossed in your garden, and if you find it, that your beans have crossed and you have this unusual variety, well, then you can save it and give it a name and keep growing it and pass it on with a story. I encourage you to do that. They're heliotropic, so they track the sun like sunflowers with their leaves, though, not with their flowers, but their leaves track the sun, and then they go into some kind of folded position at night. And the air temperature does have an effect on how they track the sun. So bean leaves would be full on to the sun when that means that the temperature at the leaf surface is optimal for photosynthesis. But when it gets really hot, like last summer during our heat waves, the leaves will actually turn so that either they're actually not allowing the sun to penetrate, or they're in an oblique position that allows the temperature at the surface of the leaf to be optimal for photosynthesis. So they're, not surprising, really smart, and they're doing all these wonderful magical things even when we're not looking. And that's one of the reasons that I love beans. And I know that these qualities or similar qualities exist with other plants, but beans are really cool. So, and they take about 90 days to maturity. So in our situation here on Denman, that means planting in mid to late May, harvesting mid to late August. And there are reasons why that's a good period for growing. Basically, I'm just wondering if I'm talking about chickpeas right now. Right. We know that fava beans and peas have a similar time to maturity, and they also grow really well here in the Pacific Northwest. But chickpeas and lentils are about 110 to 120 days. And that extra 2 or 3 weeks can be crucial in terms of the success of your crop. Because as we saw last September, if your plants, it's not quite, the soil isn't quite warm enough to plant in early May, you're not going to get the kind of vegetative growth that you need in the early stage if it's still very cool in May, as it can be here. And yet in September, if it gets very humid and you get a lot of rain, as we did last September, then the beans on the plant aren't going to ripen, or they're not going to mature properly. Just that extra 2 or 3 weeks that they're going to need, and sometimes longer that they'll need, because if you have extreme heat in the summer, that can slow things down too. And I'll talk more about that later. But basically, you're not going to necessarily get that. And we saw that with our runner beans last year. A lot of beans were produced at the top of the trellis, and it just got too cold in September for them to mature properly. So we had all these lovely pods sitting there, but they were immature, and we couldn't harvest them for drying beans. So the 90 days is a kind of, sweet spot in terms of days to maturity. And that's part of the reason that we focused on beans to the exclusion of other pulses in our project. Okay, beans benefit the land. We know that they're nitrogen fixers. Not many food crops are nitrogen fixers. They're mostly nitrogen suckers. So they take nitrogen out of the soil, and especially, staple crops like corn require a lot of nitrogen. Beans actually fix nitrogen, which means they can take inorganic nitrogen out of the air. Inorganic meaning like it's not going to be bioavailable. And then they fix it in their nodules that are little nodules on their roots. And they, in fixing it, it turns into organic nitrogen that is then available to the plant itself. So all plants need nitrogen. All green plants, most plants, need nitrogen to grow, to create their leafy mass. And then once you cut them, or once they die off, that nitrogen is then available to the soil. It gets absorbed into the soil. It's available to other plants in the soil. So growing beans enriches the soil. Cover crops, there's a lot of legumes that are used as cover crops. And that's one of the main reasons is that they are nitrogen fixers. They enrich the soil. You may have heard in permaculture circles the term chop and drop. That's usually referred to a cover crop like clover or alfalfa. And those are also nitrogen fixing plants. They're not in the pulse family because they're not considered pulses because we don't harvest their seed as a dry food. But they are legumes, and when you chop them, you drop the green matter onto the ground. So that provides nutrients, but also at that point, by reducing the canopy on the plant, the nitrogen in the nodules reduces itself correspondingly and releases into the soil. So there's this lovely symbiotic relationship that happens, and bacteria that's called rhizobium that makes it happen, which I'm not really going to get into today because that's a little bit more technical than I want to do. Beans tend to be pest resistant too. We've been very fortunate having no pests so far. And I know that Dan Jason says in his book that in 30 years growing pulses on Salt Spring, he has rarely had any pest issues with his beans. So that, that can change with more extreme temperature events. But I think in terms of relative hardiness and resistance to problems like that, beans are quite up there. They're a wonderful, easy crop to grow because they don't suffer a lot in general. And they are supposed to, I'm going to qualify that last point, they're supposed to have low watering needs after the seedling stage. And we had mixed experience with that. I know that we kind of followed that wisdom in the beginning, and it didn't really work for us, but I'll talk about that. And there could be reasons for that aren't to do with the fact that beans might be very drought tolerant. And there certainly are types of beans that are more drought tolerant. So that's the beans' benefits for the land, some of them. Beans also benefit food systems. As I said before, they're easy to grow, harvest, process, and store, and you can transport them pretty easily. You don't have to use at small scale, you don't have to use much energy or resources to grow and harvest and store beans. You just need some jars, and you need hands and a few pillowcases or reusable shopping bags to harvest them. At larger scales, you probably want to use some mechanized transport, or machines. But in general, the small scale growers like we are, we used our hands. We used our hands and our feet as well. And they're a wonderful, yeah, just super low tech, low resource crop. They're also not non-ephemeral. I alluded to that earlier. Even though long-term storage crops like potatoes, carrots, onions, they only last, a year if you're lucky, without you having to, process them further using a lot of energy like canning or dehydrating or something like that. Beans are last for, 5 or more years just simply in the jar. And there are ways of dry canning beans, which does use some more resources, but then their shelf life is increased exponentially. Also, seeds are super easy to save. They're very hardy as long as you make sure that the seed is clean and you don't have any moldy or suspect seed in the mix. The seed stores for a long time. And they're also a cheap source of protein. That's always good for food systems. Where do you get your protein from? For people, and a lot of this information is from Pulse Canada, a Pulse Association, a trade association. Beans they're a source of high quality protein when they're combined to make the full protein. They're great for blood sugar management. So for people with diabetes, they're a really good choice for protein. A lot of studies have been done on beans, and they just have many, many, many health benefits. I'm not going to go through this entire list here. One interesting part about beans is that allergies are very rare with the common bean. I mean, people are allergic to gluten, and they're allergic to, walnuts, and allergic to many different kinds of food. And even legumes, peanuts and soybeans are two of the most highly allergic foods that we have around. And they are legumes. They're not pulses. They're different species from the common bean. Common beans and even lentils and chickpeas, allergies are virtually unheard of. So it makes them a really easy to use food. And the nutritional value is very high, about 30% for many of the recommended daily amounts for a lot of nutrients. Let's continue. That's our bean field there with the trellis at the end. That was from 2021 growing season, late in the season, I can tell. So let's talk about Plan Bean in our experience. Let's move on. Okay. Now that you know why I love beans and why we love beans, I'm going to talk about our project. And it started in 2020. Here's some photos from the beginning as stages. So I guess this would be the first in chronological order. This was the tractor clearing the field, and I'll just go to the next. Yeah, okay. Anyways, I'll talk about the bean field in a minute. So the objectives in our project were basically to work together in a joyful response to the challenges of climate change. And I think Wind is here today. And I wanted to ask Wind if she feels comfortable sharing why. I don't know if I'm seeing Wind actually. Oh yeah, there. Wind, are you comfortable sharing why you wanted to start Plan Bean?
I'll unmute myself. Hi. Can you hear me? Yep. Can you hear me, Joan?
Yes, I could hear you. Thanks.
Okay, great. Why? I felt so much like we spend so much time feeling fear about the future and helpless. The helplessness was so big for me about the answers to climate change are so monstrous and massive, and it's hard to get a grip on them. And food security is a big issue with climate change. And the idea of getting better at growing beans just felt like something that we could actually get hold of and do. and not just stand back and watch it all, watch things that we have no way of influencing. So generating a local food source that wasn't already really happening, like there's people growing vegetables and growing meat and growing eggs, but beans was something that we hadn't, it was a little wedge of the pie that we hadn't really worked on yet. And the idea of being able to learn to do that better just felt so, so much more hopeful, and something to get positive feedback from, instead of these endless feelings of helplessness. And it's like, oh, we can help ourselves together. That's why.
Thanks. I'm so glad I asked you to answer that question. That's such a better answer than I could have given. And actually, you know, I think you were the inspiration behind Plan Bean, because you approached me about it and said something similar to me at the time, and you really inspired me with that. And so thank you for that. It still is true for us. And I feel really, I'm so in love with beans right now. It's great. So I won't go through this whole list because I've touched on these subjects, most of them. One of the objectives we had, though, was to produce enough beans for our families for the year. We are kind of a little subsistence farm here, so we try to do that in many different crops. But beans seemed potentially doable. So I'll talk more about if we reach that objective later. And we also want to encourage people to grow more beans and other pulses where they are and experiment. And we have seed. If you're interested, we can share. And I think there's going to be a seed swap, Erica, involved with CD Saturday, is there?
Yeah, in March, I think it's March 13th, if that's a Saturday. I don't have the date right off the bat, but I believe it may be on the website. Sorry, I don't actually know the exact date. I think it's the 12th, maybe 12th or 13th. Yeah, it's the 12th, March 12th. And then if it's really rainy that day, it'll be March 19th. And it'll be at the recycling center on Denman.
Oh, great. So it's going to be outside, so everybody can attend. Perfect. So we will be there. Plan Bean will be there. Don't know which ones of us will be there, but we will be there to talk about beans and hopefully infect some of you with the bean virus and share some of our bean seed and our stories. And we welcome you to come and share some of your seeds and stories as well. We love that. Yeah, so sharing stories and preserving locally adapted beans and varieties along with their stories is one of our objectives too. And hopefully that will take shape in the next couple of years as a pulse bank on Denman that we could share with other people on Denman and further afield if we get to that point. So yeah, I think those are our main objectives. I just want to mention that by growing enough beans, I've been experimenting with making baked beans with only Denman ingredients that are, and they're pretty, I mean, they're available on any Gulf island, I'm sure. So I just use the beans, a variety of smallish beans, not too big, not too small, and add tomato sauce and honey from my neighbor Heidi, who's also in the Bean Collective. Hi, Heidi. And apple cider vinegar that we make here as well. And if you just play with the quantities and so on, you can make delicious baked beans that are entirely local. And it feels so lovely to do that. And locally grown fresh beans, even like drying beans taste incredible. So much better than anything you buy further afield. So Plan Bean, our bean field, is based at the Snag. That's the subsistence farm that we have here at 5400 Northwest Road. And in early 2020, we recovered and expanded an old garden that the Ekstroms used to use. Some of you may remember them as the people who ran Sure Can Do Ranch here on Denman. And there was an owner in between, but we inherited the property ultimately from them. And they had purchased it as a clear cut. And so one of the things they did was create a couple of gardens down by the road, by Northwest Road. And we, all of Plan Bean members and a few folks who from our place, we cleared the lands. There's a lot of fence that was overgrown and ingrown into the ground, and there was some broom, and there was a lot of weeds and a lot of grass, and the ground was very uneven. There were a few alders that we needed to take down. So there needed to be some leveling. And we all worked really hard to clear all that and level the ground, and then till the whole area to break up the grass and so on. We had to move a couple of ant hills. That was fun. And then we fenced the area because, you need certain things to grow things around here. We call it WASP, which is water. You need access. You need sunlight. You need protection, mainly from the deer. And there was another S, and I can't remember what it was. But anyways, so we put all those things in place. And the total area was about 80 by 100 feet. And at that point, it was 30 by 60 feet initially on the bean field, but it was kind of on a slant. And so in order to make the interior road work better, we cut the bean field back to 50 feet. So now it's a square, which is much easier to work with. So it's 30 feet wide by 50 feet long. Our spacing is 18 inches. So we get 20 rows out of 30 feet. We get 20 50-foot rows out of 30 feet of bean field. And the plot gets full sun into September. Full sun meaning, about 8 hours a day at least of sun. I think it's 6 to 8 hours or something, the definition. But and that's kind of important for the reason that I mentioned earlier about if your varieties don't ripen, if their pollination gets stuck by heat or some other reasons, the flowering, then, and you do happen to have the sunny, warm September, then it's really nice to position your field in a place where the garden will actually get that sunlight in September, and not in a place where the position of the sun in September means that it doesn't get full sun. So that's just a thing to think about if you're planning to open up a new garden. And I see that I have not finished my presentation. The last item here is soil XXX. And I did find the soil report, and it looked pretty good in general. We did take a couple of soil tests, and the only things that were really short, that were really well below average, was I think calcium and magnesium in the soil. The organic matter was around 6%, which is kind of what you want. And the pH was just over 6, which is kind of what you want, a kind of neutral, slightly alkaline pH. And so we've been puzzling. A few things have puzzled us about the performance of our beans over the last 2 years, which I'll get to in a little while. But these pictures, I haven't been narrating the pictures very much, but they're kind of self-explanatory. People working in the bean field. We have a lot of fun, a lot of laughs. And we have 2 tractor drivers here at the snag who are very happy to and very graciously help us out on a regular basis. So one of the things our blurb said was we're going to talk about seed selection. And we basically selected seeds the first year based on what everybody had on hand. I know that Lisa and Heather ordered some seeds. I'm not sure, is Heidi on? Because Heidi, if you're on, maybe you want to talk a little bit about what seeds you had on hand that first year. And I think we even had a bag of like President's Choice something, right?
Yeah, I took a trip to Vancouver, and I was able to find a spot where you could get organic beans. And I remember buying a bunch of those, but we decided that some of them we wouldn't use because they could have come from an organic farm from a different climate. And some of the beans were from President's Choice, and they were Canadian grown. So that was kind of cool. But I'm just trying to see.
Do you remember which ones they were and how they grew? Like they grew pretty well, right?
some of them did. We narrowed it down though. Here under the source, the Dutch Brown and the Tongue of Fire, WD's William Dan,
Mhm.
and the you know what? I don't recall which of these perhaps it's the CO.
That's certified organic. Yeah, I think Lisa bought some
I think
beans,
those-
maybe at Edible Island or something, just certified organic beans, because she wanted to
Those
compare
are
them.
the ones, yeah, those are the ones that I think I purchased, and
you did,
Lisa got
okay.
the Prairie Garden seeds were certified organic as well,
Yeah.
and the flageolet, yeah,
That's great.
yeah. I think
So
that's it.
I think at the end I have a list of bean suppliers that Dan Jason recommends in his book. And so that's at the very end of the presentation. So we've been referring to Prairie Garden Seeds, which is one of the places that he recommends. And I'll put that information up at the end of the presentation. So we had the description of the beans. We all read the descriptions. We looked at what we had on hand, what people already wanted to order. That was, the seed catalog thing that we all do in January and February, where we're sitting cozy before the fire and it's, cold outside and we're imagining those summer crops. So we all did a bit of that. And I'm not sure, I don't remember who put this chart together, but we all basically were able to get information and then decide what varieties we thought would be worth growing. And we all gave our opinions to Lisa, who I don't think is on today. But I found an email that Lisa had written to the group about her
Yes, I am actually.
Oh, perfect. Okay, great. So maybe you want to talk about that. But before you do, I'm going to put this up. Okay. So I got this from an email, Lisa, that you had sent to us about your logic for selecting, like making the final selection of beans we were going to grow in 2020. And I thought it was a wonderful summary of your thinking around making that selection and making the planting plan. So maybe you want to speak to that.
I think we were trying to get just because our intent was to have beans to use all year in the household. I think our intent was to get beans from all the different, so so that you could make brown beans, kidney beans, black beans, pinto beans, and then we wanted to not just have a single variety of each of those categories, but more than one variety that we would trial to see if, just in case to compare, first of all, the varieties within that, but also to, if we had a failure in one variety, then we would have another variety as a backup. And we also tried, Joan said about lentils and chickpeas and stuff, not appropriate necessarily for this climate, but we did order some Canadian seed and we did try to get them, we did experiment with them. And I think it wasn't so much about that we couldn't grow them here, it was the effort after the fact. It was a lot of effort to shell those little lentils and stuff, and what you got for that effort was so in some ways it's been not just the growing but the practical aspect of afterwards. And I don't know if I have any other comments.
I want to make just a final comment about selecting. I like that you wrote here, trialing novelty beans such as adzuki just for fun. And I think that's one of the wonderful parts of doing bean trials is that you can just say, oh, let's just try this. Because every year we want to try some new varieties, and as well as growing and trying to like boost our yields of known and reliable varieties. So there's a real fun aspect to it that I love. So thanks for thinking of that, Lisa.
And I think what we want to do even more in the future, and what we certainly did in 2021, was we got from various persons on the island some contributions. So that was that was kind of our trial this year, was some success that others have had on the island, and trying to maybe grow out some of that to have enough seed for more people to trial with. So Cynthia Minden, for example, is on the call. We got some seed from her, and Naomi and others. Anyways.
Yeah, and I think we got our white runner beans from Magda Jolly and from David Critchley, I think. And we also, I'm trying to think who else. We got black turtle beans from Dylan and Emily. And yeah, we got beans from lots of folks. We got white kidneys from Allison. I'm not sure what her last name is, but yeah, it was really a lovely thing. And gathering in locally adapted and proven varieties it is a really important focus, at the same time as we will probably locally adapt more varieties too. But yeah, it's very interesting to me to look at the considerations that Lisa had about planting two similar varieties side by side, so you could easily tell at a glance how they were doing relative to one another, and that really thoughtful approach that is really, I thought it would be really helpful for folks to see that thinking process. Okay, so this was our draft planting plan in 2020. I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing this, but just so that you know, 20 rows over 30 feet. So we had an 18-inch spacing, which is quite acceptable and normal for beans. And the actual spacing within the row was 6 inches for beans and 2 inches for peas, I believe. And I don't remember the spacing for chickpeas and lentils. Maybe somebody else can chime in with that. I'm talking about year one when we did attempt to grow chickpeas and lentils. And maybe if Heather is around, she wouldn't mind talking about using the cedar that we got from the GPA. Is she around?
And so it was a little bit of a challenge to learn how to use the cedar. But actually, when they said beans, I think it was, yeah. The setting for beans was actually quite accurate at 6 inches. And I just left it there, to be honest, because when I tried to make it closer together, then they tended to come out too many at a time.
Mm-hmm.
The chickpeas or garbanzo beans were my absolute favorite bean because of the way they looked when they grew. They were adorable. There was a pod with one bean inside. And so for pure aesthetics, that's the bean I would grow, but for edibility purposes, for work, no. But yes, that was very fun. But no, I left it at the one bean setting, and then I went back later and replanted where they hadn't come up properly. How's that?
Perfect. And I do remember, yeah. So the next slide here, sorry, is the actual, like the updated planting plan. So you can see the red writing in here are beans that we had to go back and interplant because we had pretty poor germination. So that down about 2/3, the Navy CO, which is Navy certified organic, I think those were the President's Choice beans. Very well. So we planted Allison's Denman kidney beans instead, because we had a lot of those. And the Wild Jersey White from William Dam also had pretty poor germination. So we left the plants that were already there and we just interplanted some other varieties. So that's always good to keep in mind. And just the picture on the left is just basically the new bean plants. And I guess we left one of the strings there from our planting because it was really handy to have a string to guide the row, because the rows were pretty long, and even if you can eyeball it pretty well, it's handier to have that goes straight to guide you. So so yeah, that was a lot of fun. And aside from the poor germination that's in the red lettering, we had a lot of weeds in that first year, and we had very low yields. And I will talk about yields later on, but I want to address some of the problems that we identified in the first year. Basically, the soil seemed inadequate. Now it says, okay, this is another area where I haven't updated my presentation. I did check the soil report. It looks like we have adequate organic matter. So we have some other issues with the soil that we probably haven't, we need to dig deeper into. And I've written that we believe too much in the power of pulses. But basically, when we read Dan Jason's book, I mean, the advice is that beans don't need a lot of water. They can grow in any kind of soil. They're super hardy and robust and so on and so forth. But actually, we were recovering a plot that hadn't been gardened for probably 25 years. And the soil was lacking in some things. It's also relatively hydrophobic. And I think that we just underestimated how much water the beans would need. We thought we wouldn't have to water them that much. There were lots of things that we did wrong that we identified after, or things that we could have improved upon. The hydrophobic soil, and at that point we were hand watering the beans. We didn't have drip tape in year one, and that overhead watering is not very effective with hydrophobic soil. Drip irrigation is much better, because what makes it hydrophobic is the amount of time that the water takes to penetrate. So the little drip from the drip tape is much more effective at penetrating the soil than the overhead kind of broadcasting. Oh, I don't even have to feel guilty about coughing. Okay. Also, yeah, I already talked about watering. We didn't water enough. I think we came to that conclusion. We needed more regular watering. And also that the microclimate determines a lot, local conditions. What is our site like? There was a certain amount of wind at the site when it was windy, and that causes, evaporation. It sucks moisture out of the area and off the plants. And it was also kind of a heat sink in high summer too. We were just believing that beans were invincible and they were powerful and they would grow no matter what. And we learned a few lessons from that. Also, we didn't use enough mulch. We were kind of sparing on the mulch, and the second year we used a lot more, and it helped a lot. And one of the byproducts of using mulch sparingly was a lot of weeds, and we spent a lot of time weeding in the first year, or we just let it go, and that was probably worse. In the second year, things were quite different with decent mulch. And low yields, our yields in year one were very poor, nowhere near the levels that other growers who've been doing it, experienced growers, get. And I would be really interested in knowing what other Denman growers get in terms of yields if you do measure your yields. Per row foot is a good comparable measure, because we all have different size of fields and beds. And our yields in year one, and I'll show you the chart about yields a bit later on, they were just embarrassingly poor. And so, we switched things up a lot in year two. This is a picture of the bean field in year one. Yeah, that's year one. And it looks pretty healthy, but at least I feel that, and it could just be the light, but I feel that the plants didn't have that lush dark green color that I would like to see in the beans. So that to me indicates something that we could be working on. So 2020 was a little disappointing, but also it gave us actually rich soil for discovering, how we could improve things. And that's part of the exploratory part of the project, which is actually makes it most interesting. And we also had a lot of fun. Remember, this was just the beginning of COVID. That summer was the first COVID summer. And, things were very shut down. People didn't know what to do and how to respond. And we had this wonderful space in which we could be outside together. We could maintain our connections. And we had a lot of laughs and had some good conversations in the bean field. And we still, we were sanitizing our tools and the gate, and we maintained our distance from each other when, like, except for Lisa and Heather, because they're in the same pod. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in from the Bean Project and talk about how that helped us to weather COVID. Or not? Okay, I'll just carry right on. And Murphy also had fun. So much fun that she had to have a nap in the garlic field. I just thought we should say that Murphy is an honorary member of Plan Bean too. She's been there a lot of the time. I'm going to talk about year 2 now. And I just wanted to leave this quote up about agriculture because it describes really well what we are trying to do. We're trying to get reliable crops and also be ready to deal with contingencies. Last summer with the heat waves, it was kind of surprising to us. We weren't quite ready. I'm sure that many of you, and I encourage you to leave comments in the comment box or the chat box about how you weathered the heat wave last year and how it affected your crops and your growing in the garden, because it was quite surprising. And now we know that can happen. And so we're better prepared for next time. Planning with foresight and embracing what comes. I like that balance. So that's what we're trying, precisely what we're trying to do. Yeah, so year 2, after those results from year 1, we made some changes. I'm just going to put all these up because I don't know. It could be annoying to do it the other way. Whoops, sorry. There. We narrowed down the varieties from 32 varieties, if you recall on the planting chart, to 12 varieties. We planted 12 varieties in year 2. So some of them were planted in 2 rows. Some of them still had 1 rows. And those 12 included a couple of novel varieties for us. And we focused down on common beans, and we didn't regrow chickpeas and lentils or peas. I'm not quite sure why we didn't grow peas again, but I'm going to lobby for peas this year. We threw some clay soil into the bean field because it was feeling very dusty and fine, and we felt that it could use more heavy soils. So we did have a source of some clay soil. We amended it that way, and we put 3 yards of compost, spread it out. And we're aware that beans are nitrogen fixers, so they shouldn't need compost in an ongoing way. But we were recovering this garden from many years of neglect. So we felt that it was okay to add some nitrogen into the soil through compost last year, but I don't think that we are planning to do that this year. It's not something that needs to be constantly replenished when you have legumes growing in the field. Hopefully that's the idea. I already talked about mulching more. We installed drip irrigation, and that was quite a game changer. From watering by hand, which was very time consuming, and but also just in terms of weed suppression, in terms of targeting the water to the root area of the plant, which was really great. And I think that helped them to grow a lot. And also it maintained the moisture, well, with the added mulch, the drip irrigation plus heavy mulch on top was really great for retaining moisture, especially during really hot periods. And one of the final things we did in 2021 was build a trellis, because we had heard that, you get 8 or 10 feet of vertical vines instead of 2 feet of bush beans, you're going to get higher yield. So we thought we would test that out. And it's what we called a quick and dirty trellis, because we built it in 2 hours. It ended up being across the northern end of the 30-foot span of the bean field. So it wasn't shaped beans. It would be heavy, but also it would create a wind block potentially. So we didn't want to build it in one stretch that would maybe carry it backwards in the wind. And it's really survived really well. It was pretty cheap, $240, and we still have some leftover fence. Took us 2 hours. Wind and I did it by ourselves with some zip ties and a post pounder. And we used probably the most expensive thing was a bunch of 10-foot T-posts that we pounded in 2 feet into the ground. So we had about 8 foot of trellis. I don't know, Wynn, do you have anything to add about the trellis? Maybe not.
Yeah, I just am really loving the 2 photos that you put up there, Joan, with the trellis with nothing on it, and then just this whole wall of bean vine. And it's pretty exciting to see. I think Game Changer was a really good description in terms of just how much more bean per foot you got. And I was impressed at how simple it was to build, and I would definitely do that again. I loved it.
Great. Yeah, so if anybody wants to just get in touch with us, if you want to build a trellis like that, we can tell you what we did step by step. It was so easy. Like I said, 2 people, 2 hours, you know, a couple $100 in materials. And yeah, it was great. It was really wonderful. Okay, moving on from trellis. So in 2021, you know, the things we did help. We got better germination. Let me just see here. Right, I'm going to look for my notes. Right. So we didn't have any gaps in our germination like we did in 2020, where we had to interseed later on. We basically we think maybe because of the amendments, and especially especially the water availability and retention with the drip line and the heavier mulching. And we did pay attention to watering more regularly. We still didn't water a lot. And I think we will probably water more this year, but we basically were paying more attention to that aspect, which I think was kind of crucial. We're looking at local conditions, and that's what you have to look at in your own. Right beside the ocean, you might have enough mist and enough moisture in the air that you don't need to water as much, you know. So you just got to pay attention to your local conditions. Already talked about weeds. Yay, we didn't have any weeding parties last year, and our yields were pretty high. I think Wynn wants to say something.
I'm a slow processor. I just wanted to add 2 thoughts about the trellis that before we move on completely past that thought, that I think runner beans are brilliant, and the trellis really was the home of the runner beans. And the runner beans are brilliant for a couple of reasons, in my view, that they can be eaten at all stages. Like a tender green pod runner bean was absolutely delicious, one of the best vegetables I've ever eaten. And they produce gorgeous red flowers that the hummingbirds just loved right through the season, right into the fall. And then you also get the dried beans that you allow to completely mature in the pod. So they were I loved that they stacked so many functions, and that they were edible and useful in so many of their life stages. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, because I think I have a note later on that says that we're also considering planting some drying common beans, like pole beans, in addition to runner beans this year. But we haven't made our planting plan yet, so I think it's good to keep that in mind. You know, I love the taste and the uses of runner beans. I just was a little discouraged by our results, but that was only 1 year with 2 heat waves. So the runner beans, and I sit down here. We got significantly higher yields in 2021, but not as high as other growers, long-term growers
claim that they actually get, and there's a range of yields. But I do think that the heat wave did affect the beans, both the bush beans and especially the runner beans. And that could have been the reason, probably was the reason for the runner beans underperformance last year. We didn't get nearly as many as we thought. So here's our yields. And I want to thank Lisa and Heidi, especially. Is comparing the varieties that we grew in both years. So it doesn't include all the varieties it includes all the ones that we grew in this year, sorry, 2021, but not all the 2020 varieties because there were a bunch we didn't repeat. So there wasn't a point of comparison. If you look at the change column, the second column over, that gives you a good idea of what we were seeing in terms of increased yields. So we got, almost twice as much of the Becca Browns. We got less of the white kidneys, strangely. And we got slightly higher yields in some of the other varieties and very much higher yields in black turtle beans that Emily and Dylan had really generously given us. And the flageolet as well, almost 3 times as much. So we are basically boosting our yields pretty significantly. And that was in spite of the heat waves, which really did, I think, affect pollination. And I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm going to try and get through. I realize we're past the hour and I don't want to over extend people's attention. So yeah, we got some yields that were probably, as it says in the bottom, basically, I think Lisa wrote, our 2021 yields seem to be about 1/3 of what they should be. And I did find some other numbers apart from Dan Jason's yields on Salt Spring. Resilient Seeds is a small seed grower and pulse grower in northern Washington state, and their yields are lower than Dan Jason's, not as low as ours. So depending on who you compare it with, we got to between 1/3 and 1/2, and around 1/2 maybe of expected yields according to experienced growers. So that's still pretty low. We still think we can do better, but we did weather the heat waves and other things last year. So that's our conclusion. Our overall yields were higher, but still not as high as they could be or should be. Poor pollination, sorry, I don't know why I did this, but poor pollination, I think, accounted for a lot of that. Pollination occurs between a temperature range. So when it's too cold, it doesn't happen. We know this, that makes sense. But when it's too hot, it also doesn't matter. The flowers are not pollinated effectively, and then the petals drop off and you don't get the fruiting that you see. And I saw this a lot in the runner beans. I don't know if anyone else in the bean project saw it, but the runner beans have a little, on their stems, they have, about 12 or 8 or 12 potential, they have 8 or 12 flowers in a group, and some of them would have only one bean that actually grew out of those flowers, and the other flowers would just drop off. And this was happening during the heat wave. So I think it's a fair conclusion that that the pollination was just not happening. And also any additional pollination you get with insects was reduced because insects are not moving about at 90 degrees as much as they are at the more optimal temperatures, the temperate temperatures. And uneven watering, which we're trying to correct, and also high nighttime temperatures. If you don't get the temperature differential, then also that affects pollination. So I think we did see that certainly in the runner beans, and I'm going to guess maybe that's one of the reasons why the bush beans also didn't perform excellently. I've mentioned the watering. Beans are drought tolerant in relative terms, but you have to look at your site and look at your plants and look at your year-to-year experience and address that. So we'll probably be watering more. And our soil still seems hydrophobic, and I'm not sure how we would correct that. And so if you have any ideas, leave them in the chat box or bring them up in the question period, and I'll try and get there really soon. Yeah, so I'm going to move on from there. Oh, sorry, that was my blank slide. Our Our plans for this year, we haven't made our planting plan yet. We haven't had our meeting to go over and discuss what our aims are particularly for this year. But we will, we grew two kinds of black beans. One performed really well, one performed really poorly. So we'll choose the one that performed really well probably and leave behind the other one perhaps. That's the kind of selection that we'll be doing this year. I'd like to see some soup peas again in the bean field because I love French Canadian pea soup. And we might, and I have here grow pole beans and not runners, but after Wynn's comment, I think we better say grow pole beans and runners and see what we can grow on the trellis besides runners, in addition to runners. Dan Jason also talks about when you have a trellis, you can grow one row right at the base of the trellis, and then a foot out from that, you can plant another 1 or 2 rows of beans or a zigzag of vines, and then just train them to the trellis as they grow. So that's something that we can look at. And we're also only growing on one side of the trellis at the moment. So we could boost what we grow on the trellis by doing that, by taking more advantage of the space around the trellis. And we are going to automate our irrigation this year, and that will be lovely because it will be on a schedule, but that doesn't relieve us of the responsibility of paying close attention during heat waves and other, if it's going to pour rain, we probably don't want to use our precious water. So we will have to do some hands-on work as well, but having the irrigation automated will help a lot in terms of labor, the time we have to spend. Yeah, so after we get the harvest, after we grow the beans, we've made the garden, take care of the soil, choose the things, plant the beans, water them, and then comes the bounty time, harvesting, threshing, and bean counting. And I've already thanked Lisa and Heidi, especially, and all of us really for doing the counting part. These are some more pictures of us harvesting. There's Heather with a pillowcase full of beans, and we did harvest into pillowcases and reusable bags. Very low tech operation. And let me carry on. Oh, and here's some of our beans that have already been that are in the process of threshing. And we all had different ways of threshing the beans, and threshing is just getting the seeds out of the pods. You leave the beans obviously on the plant to dry, and hopefully if it's not too rainy or not too hot, then you can do that. You leave them on the plant to dry. If it's too hot, or if you leave them too long, the pods can get so dry that they burst open, and then you lose the seed into the ground. And it's really hard to harvest beans from the dirt. So you still have to pay attention. And that's one of the tenets. One of the things we're learning slowly is, we just have to constantly pay attention. If it gets really wet and rainy, then even those dry pods on the plant are going to get soft. They're not going to remain dry. And then if you harvest them into a pillowcase and forget about them for a couple of weeks, they'll probably get moldy. So you have to watch that you're avoiding both the pods cracking open and the pods from getting moist, and just get in there and harvest. You have to pay close attention at harvest time. Go in, harvest what you can. The beans, if not all of the rows were ready, then basically we harvested what was ready and kept them labeled and made sure they didn't get stuck into a corner and forgotten about, and then got moldy and so on. We had an excellent, I think, yielding of the beans. Like, we didn't lose any beans to mold or anything like that, or hardly any. And I want to ask the others if they want to comment on this process, but I especially want to comment on Lisa and Heather's innovative technique for threshing beans. And it was called Licks. I think you get what it means, but so I want to open it up to everybody else in the bean project and see if you want to talk about how you threshed and winnowed your beans. Apart from thresholds. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Joan. Brilliant. Am I on now? Yeah. Mike and I had some great conversations with a lap full of beans and a box to put them in. And I found it made us kind of slow down. And so I really recommend bean threshing as just a conversation inoculant.
Yeah.
I think
not-
our intention was to thresh them all together using the thresher. Did you do any with the thresher, Heidi?
No, actually, I didn't have enough to do, but I think in future, I think it would be fun to use the thresher.
And
You want to
maybe can
describe it,
describe
Heidi?
what that- yeah,
Oh,
I was gonna say the
The
same thing.
thresher, okay. The GPA has 2 threshers. They're basically a 2 by 4 foot plywood box with strips of wood in the bottom so that you can actually, once your beans are dry, you could just toss them in there and then step on them. And what happens then is the weight, the weight of your foot crushes the casing off the beans, and the beans themselves fall in between those strips of wood, so you're not damaging them by stomping on them. And then you can just take a fan and blow out all the chaff, and then you've got your box of beans to, your beans are at the bottom, and then you can just collect them by dumping out the box. So that would go very quickly as long as your beans are completely dry. Yeah, and those are for the GPA members. They're free to borrow. Yeah.
I'd be interested in trying it. I did a like kind of a homemade thresher. I just kept the beans in the pillowcases, and I got some thick socks on, and I just put it down on the living room floor carefully, like with the edge folded over, and I just stomped on the beans and then poured them out into like a big bowl or whatever. And then the beans tend to go down to the bottom, and the pods tend to go up to the top. I probably took more time doing it than I would have if I had used a fan. But yeah, there's so many different ways to do it that are very low tech and that don't require any special equipment. And as Heidi said, the GPA boxes from the GPA, a lot of fun as a shared activity as well. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so thresh flicks, we're done. So this is a picture of some of our beans. I took it this morning. And I just want to ask you to just contemplate the beauty of these beans. They're so beautiful. I think we each got about 14 pounds of beans, each household. And we, as I said, we expect that to increase over time. Probably it's not enough yet to supply our households with beans for the year, especially as we increase our pulse consumption. But it's a pretty good haul, and the beans are so beautiful. They're a pleasure to cook. They taste delicious, and yeah, it's been a real pleasure to. So just to wrap up, I want to, let me just skip ahead here because I've got a couple of slides I'm going to skip over. Right, sorry, go back. As Plan Bean, we're interested in doing outreach to our community and beyond. And some of the ways that we want to do that is through planting, weeding, and harvesting parties. So inviting folks from the broader community to come and help us at those times and have a kind of a celebration around those yearly activities. We also would love to have pulse potlucks. And we know that COVID is limiting us to some degree at this time, but you know, a lot of these events can be done outside and safely. So near the bean field, we have an outdoor kitchen, so we could easily plan something like that. And presentations like this one, sharing seeds, as I've already mentioned, and also creating a Denman Pulse Bank where we collect together seeds and we keep them viable by growing them out from people who are growing on Denman, on Hornby, Lasqueti, and further afield. So we welcome you to get in touch with us. And you know, we also are interested in expanding our project to include more people. We haven't figured out exactly how we're going to do that at this time, but if you are interested in getting involved on a more regular basis, then definitely reach out to us either through the GPA or in the chat box, and we'll get in touch with you. So that's the second last thing I want to say. And this is the final reflection. So remember, I asked you to go get some beans or other pulses from your pantry or your seed shelf. Well, at this point, I'd like to ask you to take those beans in your hand, just hold them. As you're doing this, just feel their texture, how smooth and round they are, how firm they are and strong. I'd like to refer back to the quote by Robin Wall Kimmerer at the beginning of this presentation, and invite you to close your eyes and just listen as you feel the weight of the beans in your hand and their roundness, their texture, and envision how the word pulse links your own heart to the living seeds that you hold in your hand. These beans are a gift from our mother, the earth, and I'm filled with gratitude for that gift. These beans in our hands are here because others have saved them through the millennia. And like those bean keepers of old, we are now the custodians of these seeds. We preserve them for future generations. These beans are little beads on the chain that stretches back more than 10,000 years and will hopefully stretch even further into the future. Thanks for being here today.
Don't you mean thanks for being here today?
Thanks for being here today. Yeah. Thanks for having been here today.
Thank you, Joan, and other members of Plan Bean. That was really fascinating, and so much good information on your experiences, and thanks for being real about, you know, what worked and what didn't. And I think everyone can learn a lot from that. So there's a few comments in the chat that Joan, maybe you just want to go through and skim those in case there's questions that you want to answer quickly. There's not too many.
His enthusiasm about the taste of the beans, I thought, yeah. Right. Dried beans are dried beans, but I can't go back now. Like now I have to grow my own, but it's just like growing your own asparagus or growing your own vegetables. I had no idea that dried beans, there would be a difference, but it's, so for me, that's been the big revelation, was really and it's also the cooking time. You know, it's like you can soak beans overnight and then cook them in 20 minutes. You buy them from the store, you soak them overnight and you cook them for 2 hours, right? So yeah, anyways, I just wanted to make a comment about the taste, and that ultimately, yeah, that's been the big bonus.
Thanks, Lisa. I can't believe I didn't mention that. Like, they gotta taste good, right? And the cooking time is huge. You know, when we think about the future and, you know, preparing for harsh times, limiting our use of resources, which has been like off the charts, we know, in North America for many decades, just pulling back our resource use, and it is really important, and growing your own beans and not using all those resources to get the beans and then not using them to cook the beans is really, really satisfying. I don't know if anyone else in Plan Bean wanted to make some final comments, and we can also field some questions. Erica, you're watching the chat. I guess I can go through it myself.
Yeah,
Or
there's
maybe,
I can read out
yeah.
some questions for you. There's just a few.
Yeah, and can I just say, I don't need to answer the questions. Maybe other Plan Bean folks can jump in, because I'm sure you've all heard my voice enough today.
Okay, so the first question, I'll just go down the list. The first was from me, and I just wondered what the difference is between a black bean and a black turtle bean, because those were both on your list. Is one just smaller?
Does anybody want to talk about that?
I think the turtle bean is slightly smaller than the black bean that we have. The black beans seem to be quite fatter in shape, but I'm not sure of the flavor. Somebody else will have to, somebody else may know more about the comparing the flavors.
Cool. Yeah, I was just curious. The next question, well, Jody mentions, has anyone tried early pinkies from Salt Spring season? Then I noticed on your planting list, there actually were pinkies from Stoughton Falls Farm. So maybe there's an early pinkies from Salt Spring, and that's different from these pinkies, but I don't know if anyone wants to talk about pinkies anymore. Such a cute word to say.
I think Lisa and Heather got those beans. I don't know if they want to mention some things about them. And I think they yielded really well.
We just got them from a friend in Courtney who operates Stoughton Farms. And she likes them. She has a lot of shade on her property. And so for her, she needs a bean that matures in a shorter period of time. So hence the name early pinkies. So they tend to be the first bean that it's ready. And yield wise, they were for us also one of the top yielders. So that we just wanted to try them out because of the enthusiasm of a friend of ours for them.
Nice. The next question, thanks for that, was, did you use straw for mulch the second year? Can you talk a bit more about mulching? That's a question from Gail.
I'll
I can-
answer that. Okay, somebody else can
great.
take it.
I'll go for it, Heidi.
Oh, you just.
Okay, Heidi and I were both going to jump in on that. We used hay both years. We got our hay from Cheryl Hinkleman, and we found hay was, it was really nice to have a local source. It was cost-wise, it was much less than straw would have been, and it distributed really nicely. And because we put it on quite thickly, we didn't have trouble with regrowth from the hay, which I've never really had that much trouble with, but people worry about that. I wouldn't worry about it. The local grape grass hay was awesome.
I can add that having drip irrigation plus that kind of hay is key, because if you're overhead watering onto that hay, you are going to get sprouting, a lot of sprouting, and it can be a real hassle. But having the drip irrigation plus the hay it's so localized, the irrigation, the watering, that yeah, the seeds in the hay don't have a chance.
Great, thank you. Another question from Cynthia is, we plan to grow a lot of edamame beans this year. Any info about them?
I think edamames are soybeans, are they? So they would have, they're are legumes, they're not pulses. They're not considered pulses, but they have a much higher fat content, but I don't know if we ever, did we grow some in year one? I don't recall that, but yeah, I don't think we have experience. I don't anyways. I don't know about the other folks.
I think I know Danny Crenna has tried growing edamame before, and I'm hosting in her place today, but Cynthia, you might want to reach out to her and ask her about hers. And maybe some of the other seed savers who are around in March, on March 12th at the seed exchange might have some info. There are lots and lots of thank yous, great presentations in the comments. Wendy Boothroyd says, we measured our black bean yields by grams per plant, turtle beans 90 grams per plant, and black cocoa beans 66 grams per plant. So just a bit of info there on yields of black beans and the difference. And then also pole beans beat out the bush beans. Grandma Walters cranberry beans 128 grams per plant. And that's all the questions, I think, unless I missed any, and someone can chime in but I think that was all. People are saying they're going to eat beans for dinner tonight, and that's great. And this is really inspiring for sure. So yeah, thanks everyone for being here, or for being here.
I wonder if anyone who's still here has any questions they want to ask right now that weren't in the comments, but just to wrap up.
Sure. And actually one just popped in from Liz. How do we get a hold of the bean group?
We are on the Denman Climate Action Network. I can actually post a link in the comments in the chat box. I might stop my screen sharing.
I've already got your link right here, so I'll do it.
Oh, do you? Perfect. So Erica's, thank you. It's so nice to have a tech person on hand when we're doing this.
So that's the DICAN link for Plan Bean, and I'm assuming there's some contact info on there.
I think that goes to Lisa, and Lisa, you feel free to forward it on to us. We don't have our own little website yet, but maybe that's something as we get the pulse seed bank going and so on, and do more outreach, we'll probably have to set up our own little, at least a Facebook page, so that people can get in touch with us.
Nice. Okay, well,
sorry, can I say something?
Yeah. Hi, Wendy.
That was really good, Joan. Thank you very much. I was trying to see from your tables what the conclusions were that you had of the beans that were growing best for you guys. And I couldn't really see that. Like it said black beans, but I didn't know what kind of black beans you were growing. Like I guess I could get that at CD Saturday. I could find out.
This is our yield. There. Does that help a little bit?
So which kind of, yeah, I just didn't know like what you're talking about for black beans, because there's quite a few that could be.
So we did yield per row foot, I think is the most comparable amount. Black turtle beans for Emily and Dylan, we got 36.9 grams per row foot, which would be 2 plants. So pretty low still, right? And then the other black beans were much lower. They were our lowest yielding bean probably this year. So yeah, so we still, I'm curious how people if they felt that the heat wave affected, because that was my theory, that we got our pollination was affected and so on. But yeah, I don't know.
Wind, do you know what variety the black beans were? Are they just ones that you've saved over time?
The black beans may have been, if it was the second year, it might have been the ones that we got from Stacey Armstrong, which were really, which had a really good yield. Mm-hmm. And I could ask her what she knows about the variety, and then I'll post that info.
Thanks, Wendy.
Yes, they were the ones saved from the first year. So you're right, Wendy, that's where they'll be from.
Yeah, it'll be interesting if we're talking about 60 grams or more per plant. That's like 120 grams per row foot. at 6-inch spacing, and compared to what we're getting, that's more in the range of kind of optimal yield. We're far below that still, and we're still trying to puzzle out why that is and try and take measures that might make sense to address that.
One thing we didn't kind of talk about is we really, I mean, part of our approach was to take a real, a simple approach in terms of, I mean, so it's much more of an extensive system as opposed to an intensive system. So because we don't all live near the plot, so we're not all kind of hovering over the beans all the time. So we kind of wanted to, you know, go in there, plow it, plant them, mulch it, and leave them alone. So that, I mean, that may explain some of the yields and stuff too. So the yield may be much higher in an intensive, like, garden situation. And I think what we want to do in the future is, even if you're not directly involved with the project, is to maybe get together with everyone and compare varieties, compare yields. And I encourage everyone to kind of keep track of their yields and to really get together and talk about that later. Because one of the things we're hoping to do this year is we're going to plant some on our property as well. For me, one of the reasons of having the extensive, you know, field plot was because I always thought, you know, beans took up too much room for dried beans, and so I wanted to, you know, plant them somewhere else because I just didn't have enough room. So yeah, that would be interesting to find out if how others can get enough for their family, but in a small space. And certainly, as Wendy said, that the trellis system may be one of those answers.
Yeah, there is that saying that the best fertilizer is the farmer's footsteps. And if you're not stepping too often near the beans, then yeah, then it's they're not going to do as well as a crop that you live right beside and you're watering and watching all the time. Still feel that the soil is a piece of the puzzle, because the soil is hydrophobic, not sure why. And yet the soil report puts the soil in kind of standard, you know, acceptable ranges for most things, including organic matter. And I feel that the soil is not friable enough. It's not rich and loamy like you would really want in a lovely kind of garden, you know, high yielding setting. So we're still puzzling with that. And if people have ideas, including my Plan B members, we got to work on that probably. I don't know if there are any more comments or questions. Erica, though I know it's probably time to wrap up. I'm happy to wrap up now and thank everybody for coming and participating. Really appreciate the opportunity to lay out our project and where we're at. And yeah, I hope we to hear from some of you. Thanks everybody, the Plan Beanies, for being here.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Joan and Heidi and Heather and Lisa and Wind, for all of your amazing work and sharing this knowledge with us today. And thanks for everyone for being online. And this presentation will be has been recorded, and it will be posted on the Denman GPA website under the CD Saturday link. And I posted that at the top of the chat. And again, that's just a reminder that if you'd like to make a donation for the talk today or to the GPA to get a membership, you can do that at that same link in the top of the chat. And yeah, I guess we'll sign off now. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Erica.
Have a
I
lovely,
really appreciate your support.
day. Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Thanks everybody. Thanks Wind and Mike and Heather and Lisa and Heidi.
Thanks, Joan.
Hey, you're welcome. It was so much fun. Bye.
Good job.